So can you talk to me a bit about what it's like working with the World Food Program? I mean, from a professional and from a humane level, how is that?
I started working with the World Food Program in 2018, and when I saw the ad and I applied, I didn't know what WFP was. I just saw there was a blue thing and then the UN logo. I was like, oh, that's something, the UN. And I was like, WFP, because they're really bad at marketing. So a lot of people don't even know what they do, but in fact, they're the biggest humanitarian organization out there. They're the biggest one in terms of um, yeah, like capacity, and they bring food where it's the hardest place to go on earth. So from Gaza to Sudan, South Sudan, Afghanistan. And as I said, I didn't know who was the WFP, and then I applied, and then I think the WFP was in my heart. And I think that's also the cool thing when you work with people, that everyone is very passionate. And yeah, that's I felt like a bit of my calling in life. I'm a supply chain expert or professional, and I work in the private sector. And then I thought, I think I'm also an idealist, and there was a perfect match where I think I could use all the supply chain expertise in the humanitarian context. And WHP is very fast paced. As I said, they're really on the ground front line. And yeah, I had the chance to also work in different positions, from supply chain planning to retail to head of supply chain, and in different country, from Rome, Senegal to Syria, Madagascar, and recently Jerusalem and Gaza.
Mara, I spent so many hours behind a laptop and looking at numbers. And then when I actually go on the ground, it just changes everything. When you actually see the product you're building, what your company is building. In your case, it's an extreme level. You're going to places where people literally have nothing. So you're using your professional expertise, but you're seeing people on the ground, how it really impacts them. How does that feel when you see like the work you're doing affecting real people's lives? I mean, it must be a bit overwhelming.
Yeah, I think also to stay grounded and humble, because I think you have also NGOs and local partners who are doing and taking much more risk than what UN will take, because they are very, very frontline and they are critical also in any emergency response. So with a grain of humility here, yeah, I mean that's why I also try to avoid staying in headquarter when I was working with the UN, and I also, and now what I'm trying to build with Arch is also to be closer to the field, of working either with suppliers or with the humanitarians. And because I think that's where you understand the needs, and more than often than not, a lot of great ideas are stuck somewhere in capitals. So people sitting in Munich, in Rome, in Copenhagen, New York, and do very fancy things that then just stay there because they cannot be utilized by the people in the field because they don't have time, they don't have internet or unstable internet. So in that field, you have to be very agile, and you can only do that and create value if you have been eating dust, being in the bush, and you understand what it means, and you can put yourself in the shoes of someone who will use your end product, whatever it is, or your solution.
You've been in supply chain for a long time in different roles. So I'm wondering, do you feel like nowadays supply chain is getting simpler with the technology that we have, or it's quite the opposite? It's much more chaotic because of geopolitical changes, and there's a lot of regulations that didn't exist. So talk to me a bit about the field. Do you feel like over the years it got easier, or it's like a more and more complex web?
I mean, of course, it's interesting because, back, I would say 10 years back, the private sector supply chain was all about lean. Like everyone was obsessed with lean, Kaizen, continuous improvement, black belt, cutting fats, no inventory. And then COVID arrived and people were like, oh, actually, I do need some inventory. So the humanitarian supply chain is it's very different. Is fat. It's built to be fat because it's built of just in case. So it's just not just in time. It's just in case. We rather have stock, and you buffer stock. around the world so that if an emergency strike in Pakistan, you can reply in 24 hours and you can send the first charter flight because you have your stock ready. So they already, I think the private sector starts understanding and go more in this risk metrics and started thinking about risk mitigation, that the humanitarian sector was built on risk mitigation because that's how you actually can, you can be agile. No, I think the humanitarian sector tries to go back to what the private sector is doing on being much more efficient and lean. And they are also, everyone now understands that 60 to 80% of the humanitarian response operation cost is in your supply chain. So the supply chain is a massive leverage to be much more lean and leaner. And this is a big topic in the UN at the moment. It's the UN 80 reform in the 80 years of the UN, where they're, talking about merging agencies and potentially starting also leveraging the buying power. 'Cause the UN together last year, like they bought more than $25 billion that was purchased by the UN. It's not nothing. But I think like a lot of potential for economies of scales are not fully leveraged because people are duplicating effort, for example, or because especially in deep fields, there's a bit of a lack of markets understanding of, what is the market, who is out there. And I think that's where private sector solution that exists for 20 years can also support the UN in that sense in supply chain.
And so, knowing all that, you decided to give it a go and start your own company. So, before we get into the details, Mara, I'm just wondering. So, you did the corporate, you did the humanitarian, and then you decided you wanted to build your own company. So, talk to me
Mm.
a bit about why you decided that it was the right time and why the UAE.
I think it's somehow it's never the right time, but I think the my answer is not going to be super sexy and like, oh wow, this was the idea that I had to. So to be honest, now as I told you, I always in the back of my head, I always dreamed to have my own business. As I told you, I was selling soy milk to expats in Palestine. When I was a kid, I was daydreaming of having my own French bakery when I would be an expat somewhere. So I had these dreams. And I worked in the UAE, and I there's something that I find very inspiring in the UAE. It can be hectic, stressful, but there's something, I don't know, when I look at the Burj Khalifa at night, shining and standing so tall, I does inspire me, and I think there's some boldness there. So I wanted to stay around the UAE and the GCC. And I also feel in my field, humanitarian sector, there's a big, I think that they're going to be at the center in the years to come, especially with UAE having pulled out. I think this region is going to play a role being UAE, Saudi Arabia, or Qatar. So I left before going to Gaza, Jerusalem with WFP for my last mission. And I wanted to have my residency. And I thought, well, let me open a business. And it's also going to be a very good reason to not be stuck with the UN and accept an extension and another role and what's not, because I will know that I have something to go back to and develop from scratch. So I had some ideas. I knew that I had a private sector clients who say, back then it was a prospect, who say would be interested to start looking at aid and relief from a logistic perspective. And that's how I did it. And I was like, well, let's see and let's try. And now I'm like 9 months after, and yeah, still developing it. And just came back from the UAE now for 2 weeks back, and it's always so energizing, yes. To say.
So, you talked to me about a prospect. Talk to me a bit about the type of clientele you're looking for.
Mm. So with Arch, the idea is it comes with the idea being in the field that I was a bit frustrated that humanitarians tend to be in their own tiny bubble. They don't talk to the private sector, or they talk to them through RFQs and standard procurement emails, and so they have very little information of what's out there. And as a result, also I think they are not leveraging potential solution, better pricing, and I was doing things also differently. So when I was in Madagascar, I was, meeting, being at an logistic company, shipping companies, yeah, just to understand, what are the flows, like who are the big traders, how does it work, so that I could also bring some information and be able to better negotiate, even if it's through an official RFQ, official tenders. That is, as it's public procurement, it always has to be very square and transparent. But then I really had this idea, okay, how could we bring the private sector more attuned or aligned with the humanitarian work? And so my first idea was that, yeah, I want to support regional and local suppliers that are that have great product or services to be able to be competitive and be reliable partners for the UN or NGOs. And Johnny, it's difficult because, when they see first, the suppliers don't even know where to start and how to start because it's so, it's like a black box, and you don't know how do you get registered, where you get registered, where are the tenders. Oh, but the tenders is all in French or in English, but we don't have people really speaking that in South Sudan, or I don't know. Or the tenders is 50 pages long. I have no people or no one to actually fill that out. So bringing that support to the private sector and helping them, bring their services to the UN. So that's one part of what I'm doing. And on the other side, I think I have a lot of expertise also with ex-humanitarians who also are private sector, that have private sector background. And I do think that the UN, especially and the NGO, might start outsourcing some of the work going forward because they can no longer afford having this big size organization. Headcount is being reduced, and I don't think it's going to expand, but it's still going to have to do the work. So I think it's also a future of work is to start outsourcing some of the services, and supply chain is one of the things that you could outsource. And then I'm positioning myself also with my team of ex-humanitarian private sector, being able to agile and take some project and support and say, well, you have a project on a supply chain in a specific country, then we can support. And it's not a big consulting company where they might not really understand the reality of the ground and understand what humanitarian go through. Is that we do speak that language, and at the same time we also do have the private sector expertise and experience.
I
So
feel like
I'm on those two words.
it's interesting because I feel like people who work at the UN, they would probably trust someone who understands, who has lived through what they are living through. So you could easily go through a big consulting company or go to someone who's a supply chain expert, but going to someone who has actually real on the ground experience and knows what at stake, it gives you a lot of credibility.
So I think you point the right word, trust. The humanitarian multilateral sector is a bit of a closed trust-based sector where it's hard to earn trust and it's very easy to break it because, as I said, that mm, they work a bit in their own bubble. A lot of people are never been in the private sector or not interested. It might change a bit, but let's say. And so, yeah, you earn your credit and you earn your stars when you've been out in the field and you've lived the reality, and you spilled some sweat in the process. So I do think, yes, I get quite a lot of positive feedback. Of course, it's a bit tough at the moment because there's massive consulting freeze, at least for NGOs. So I think the sector is really going through this change where, first there was a shock and the grieving for 3, 4 months, then like quick action of letting go. The NGO and the UN at least cut some 20 or 30% of the staff. And they're still in this restructuring modus until end of the year, which is also means when you talk to someone, the decision maker of today may be gone in a couple of months. But I think, as I said, like the trend for me is there that the headcount's going to be kept down and outsourcing, and there will be more outsourcing.
I mean, it kind of feels like it's not only the UN serving unstable places. It feels like the UN itself is currently unstable based on what you're t telling me.
Well, they have to, I'm not sure unstable is the right word. I think the UN is going through change and they are going, they're figuring out between the agencies how to merge, how to get efficiency gains by, by putting the operation together. Supply chain is a good example, like there's this whole idea floating around of one supply chain. So you have one cell, one planning team, one procurement team. Um, and it's interesting because, as I said, like I'm, and people in my team, we are able to talk business, which means that I'm also able to talk to suppliers when I go to fair. And, suppliers are also challenging the UN. So, like, guys, you all have 15 different requirements for the same basic jerry can. So instead of putting one order for the big order of jerry cans and negotiating 15% discount, everyone wants his own little specs and then branded. So, you miss out on such opportunities. So I think this is what the UN is going through and the sector is like, okay, how can we be more lean? How can we be more efficient? And I think the donors are pushing this big time, actually. And I think it's right and it's okay and it's painful. It's very painful. And I guess it was done in a very rush way that has consequences for millions of people. And I'm not sure that this was the right way, but I think like it the need to reform the system is real.
Mara, I want to ask you about the culture, the cultural impact when you're working in a job like yours. I've talked to you for about half an hour, maybe 20 minutes now, 10, 5 minutes before we started the recording. And I felt like you could have been from three or four or five different nationalities. You sound
Mm,
fluent in multiple languages. So I'm just wondering, is this very important in the job that you do to be able to understand the culture so that people can trust you on the ground? And I'm talking in your consultancy business as well. Do you feel like it's important that people relate to you, especially on both sides? Since in supply chain, you're
mm,
usually talking to two very different
mm.
types of people from point A to point B.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I always think that language is an incredible connector, right? It gets you connected to the people, and I've always tried to learn some wherever I've been. Being, I speak Arabic or picking up Hebrew if I need to talk to suppliers in Jerusalem or in Tel Aviv. So I would think that cultural is important, but I also think this is the strength of the UN and I used to work with is that people, I mean, this is what I love, no? That, I don't know, one day my boss is from Pakistan, my colleague is from Uganda. I will have, all this mix and that's kind of fun. And also because of you have an emergency and you work in emergency, you don't have the luxury to backbite and you don't have time for that, no? So if someone speaks and seems to offend you, you are like, oh, but maybe it's just fine in his or her culture, and you just go with the flow. Now, for business, yes, I think it helps. And for example, now I'm focusing my effort more in the GCC because I'm also a bit more comfortable. I mean, I've been once in the UAE, but I landed in Riyadh just for 2 days, and I felt immediately at ease. And I think because I could talk to the taxi driver and we can exchange, and I think that definitely helps. Now, if I would, for example, be interested to start entering Kenya and Sudan, and I don't know anyone, then yeah, first thing I would do is create that link, no? Either with the suppliers or a subcontractor, an agent. And it's also learning how they do business, no? So probably is going to drink tea and coffee and chit chat and talk about family and whatever, and then we talk about business. So I think having this humility of understanding people doing business differently or in based on the culture helps. And my background also in the UN, I think, helps having this open mind, let's say.
Mara, I think to do what you're doing right now not only takes domain expertise, but it takes real passion because it's not an easy field at all. So I commend you for that. And I think it was fascinating talking to you. Mara, thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you, Antoine.